Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Has Rahul Gandhi embarrassed, demoralized and severely disadvantaged the Congress party by his inexplicable decision to disappear on leave just as the budget session starts? Or is there a credible defence that his supporters could come up with? In part 2, Mani Shankar Iyer, a man renowned as a Gandhi family loyalist, will attempt to put the best face on Rahul Gandhi's vanishing act. But first, 4 days before the budget, what key measures are India's top industrialists and bankers hoping for? This is a seminal budget, and many economic future of the country depends on what it delivers. But it all hinges on whether Mr. Jaitley can take the steps and push through the reforms that will encourage growth, create jobs, increase incomes, and therefore improve both individual livelihood and India's international standing. So what is it that Mr. Jaitley needs to do to deliver this outcome? With me to discuss what they want to see in the budget are the Joint Managing Director of Hero MotoCorp and former President of CII, Sunil Munjal, the Chairman and Managing Director of Triveni Turbines and also a former President of CII, Dhruv Soni, and the Chairperson India and Director Asia Pacific of HSBC Bank and a former President of FICCI, Naina Lal Kidwai. Naina Lal Kidwai, let's start with the fiscal deficit. Many people believe that with the oil price down to just about $60 a barrel and with disinvestment, coal block sales and spectrum sales picking up, Mr. Jaitley should have no problem meeting his 4.1% fiscal target for this year. The key question that I want to put to you is, what target should he set for next year? Should he follow the roadmap and agree to accept the 3.6 target and then go down to 3 after that? Or given the economic situation, should he relax the fiscal deficit and hope to boost investment and growth that way?
Karan, I really think that he should give himself the breathing space and leeway of aiming for a fiscal deficit of 3.8 rather than the 3.6. Of course, it would be great to have 3.6. But what we need is a lot more spending happening in the economy, and government has to do the spending. In fact, as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Arvind Subramaniam himself said in his midterm review, the spending needs to come from the PSUs, from government, given the overburdened and highly leveraged private sector. So if this is to happen and growth has to return, we have seen a significant drop in revenues, in tax to GDP ratios, and for growth to come back, I think the spending becomes key. Okay. Now, I say this with some caution because the spending needs to happen more for capital expenditure rather than current, because India today has one of the worst ratios. Actually, we are the worst in the region other than Korea in terms of our capital expenditure spend, which is 2% of GDP, and current expenditure spend, which is 10%. Sure. And what we really need is to see an inversion of that. Now, but that being said, if the money is well spent, it would work well.
Dhruv Soni, there is another view which is the opposite of what you've heard from Naina Lal Kidwai, and it's the view that rating agencies seem to take, and it's the view that some economists take, that 4.1 is critical, A, because it's a commitment the finance minister has not just made, but repeatedly stressed and even now publicly said he's going to make it. If he doesn't, it could endanger India's standing, and if that happens, it could endanger investments. So where do you stand on this? Should he, beyond achieving 4.1, relax the 3.6 for next year?
Karan, I would take it in a little different way. I think he can really do two things. The first is the realization that in the capital equipment space, investment demand is very low. Demand for capital goods is very low, and it can only come with government expenditure on infrastructure. Now, your question is, where did he find the money from?
Absolutely.
I think he has to be much bolder in public sector disinvestment. And this can happen both in the central level and a little bit at the state level. So he can revolve this capital. He can, the government can sell shares and get capital to put into investment. Without that, we will not get the engine turning. Some of our sectors are 25–30% lower than what they were in 2011 and 12. So jobs and growth is now coming to a breaking point, and we really need a bold initiative from the finance minister in this budget right now.
You know, Naina Lal Kadwai, I'm going to stick with this issue for a little while longer because both the savings and investment rates have in the last 7 years actually precipitously come down. They're both somewhere hovering around 31, 32%. They were a good 6-7% higher 7 years ago. Now, one argument made yesterday by Shankar Acharya, the former chief economic advisor to this program, was that in fact the best way for the government to ramp up capital spending would be to increase the tax to GDP ratio. And he talked about increasing SENVAT, he talked about increasing service tax, something that he may anyway have to do when GST happens. Do you think that would be a better route than taking the risk of tinkering with the fiscal deficit target and running the risk of a ratings degrade?
Well, clearly, if we can take the revenues up, and I do think that service tax, there could be some equalization given that GST is around the corner, then that becomes a way. But I don't think it will be sufficient, and therefore I would really beg for the leeway to kickstart the economy and really push growth ahead. And I think the other thing that we have to bear in mind is, of course, we will achieve the 4.1% this year. But Karan, it's important to remember that the 4.1% will be achieved after cutting back of expenditure.
Sure.
And we will do the same nonsense next year and the next year unless we can correct that.
Can I interrupt?
So
you're a banker.
The quality of the
How will the
deficit
ratings agencies view Mr. Jaitley playing around with the fiscal deficit target of 3.6 and giving it up? Will they take an adverse view, or will they be understanding, particularly if the money is for infrastructure and for growth?
I think the adverse view is a given if we don't communicate it well enough. However, if we can explain that the quality of the fisc improves and the commitment to get down to 3% is still very much there, becomes a way of communicating this. So you look at some reprieve to correct this, because everybody sees what we're doing. We just slash our expenditure budget towards the second half of the year in order to achieve the artificial fisc level that we set ourselves.
Now, the other key issue, Dhruv, that he has to face when he comes up with his budget is expenditure. The Bimal Jalan Committee has already submitted its first interim report a couple of months ago. It's believed that it could be submitting its final report any day if newspaper accounts can be believed. The government has been lucky this year. The oil price has come down. Diesel, as a result, was safely deregulated. Subsidy on oil is substantially down. But the big question is, what should the finance minister do about the food grade subsidy? What should he do about the kerosene subsidy and the fertilizer beyond that? Do you think this is an opportune moment to start paring those down, or perhaps even cutting them more substantially? Or in the present climate, after losing Delhi, would that be unwise?
Well, I
Karan,
think that the subsidy question has to be...
Dhruv Sawhney, that's to Dhruv Sawhney. Go ahead, Dhruv Sawhney.
Yeah, sorry. Karan, I think he has to take this full on. I know there's the Bihar elections coming up, and then after that there's the UP elections. But we really need to tackle this question of growth and employment. And if he has to do that, which is what he talked about, development and make in India, then we have to really get more jobs and more investment through. And that needs revenues for the government. So there's very few avenues. I do not think the taxation, increasing taxes is the right way to go. It's going to spoil the sentiment, and this is a time, a very critical time, when we have to kickstart growth. So I really think a little bit of the subsidy question can be looked at, and especially some of the inefficient subsidies. You know, the Food Corporation of India is a terribly inefficient way of distributing food, and a lot of subsidy goes out over there. So I think efficiency and tinkering with the subsidy are two very primary things that this budget should look at.
But I also think let me interrupt you there. Dhruv Sawhney, do you think one way of handling subsidies is to go in for more direct benefit transfer, as is already happening in the LPG case, using the Aadhaar route? Would that be a clever way of doing it?
Absolutely, Karan, I think that is it. We have to take the inefficiency out of the subsidy distribution system. We are having a lot of leakages. Some say, I know in the case of sugar, when we had levy sugar, it was 90%. So there's a lot of leakages in the subsidy system, and a direct subsidy is one of the better ways of handling this efficiently.
Now, I've got Sunil Munjal, who's also a former chairman of CII. He's a joint managing director of Hero MotoCorp. Welcome to the program, Sunil Munjal. I want to come and discuss with you some of the more clear-cut reform measures that people are hoping will be taken, and ask you which ones you think are important. For a start, there is one that many believe is a leftover from last year. It should have been tackled last year. It wasn't. It still lingers. And I want to ask you how much of a cloud it's created. I'm talking about the Vodafone retrospective taxation matter that affects many more companies than just Vodafone. Last year, the finance minister didn't reverse it. All he did was to promise it wouldn't happen again, but it's there on the statute books and people see it as a sword of Damocles. Is it a problem that puts off investors, or is it something people have taken on board, and have they accepted this government's assurance not to use it again is sufficient? Where do you stand on that?
So I think what the government said, Karan, is not just that we will not use it again. They said we will allow this to run its normal legal course, because if we change it, we will be doing what we are saying should not be done. It will have to be a retrospective amendment even to change it. And fortunately, the two cases which have come up in court, and you're right, by the way, it was not just one case, there were multiple cases going on. The two cases which have come up in court have gone in favor of the assessees, and the government has not protested or gone back to a higher court. So they've demonstrated what they're saying, they've followed through with action. But to your earlier point, I think I completely agree with Dhruv that there is a need to create an environment of growth, because it's only development, growth and prosperity that you can distribute. So the need for the government to focus on potential high growth areas is very, very high, very important. As also to retarget subsidies. Subsidies in a country like India cannot be taken away, because a section of the population needs and deserves it. But it must remain only there. We have to stop the leakage, and we have to also stop passing on subsidies to those who don't need or deserve it.
You know, on that...
And you have a wonderful tool today that...
Yes, finish. Go ahead, finish.
So, you have two tools available to you. One is the UID, which identifies each individual, and second, now having opened millions and millions of new bank accounts, you can directly put money in people's accounts, and I think that's a phenomenally powerful game-changing tool available with the government.
You know, on
this can allow us to,
on that question of bank accounts, Naina Lal Kidwai, one reads in the papers that practically 100% reach has been established through the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana, but equally, the number of accounts that have zero balance has also gone up by an astonishing 100%. Something like 60% of the new accounts, according to some newspaper reports, have no balance at all. So what has been achieved there beyond creating a vehicle for pushing DBT funds?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it, Karan. It is to push the direct benefit transfer funds, and the money that kicks in through that for those that have opened the accounts is critical, because without it you can't do a DBT. So I think it's a very essential part of knitting the UID bank account and the direct benefit transfers together. And yes, there will be some which will remain dormant because they aren't beneficiaries therein, but I hope that it will begin to incite people to use these accounts further. So I think it is a noble effort. It is key that these accounts get used, because just opening them and having them lie would be a shame. I just want to come back to the subsidy one, and the key one that I would look for is the fertilizer subsidy, because we are seeing that, you know, food is likely to come through the direct benefit transfers. We're seeing kerosene, LPG coming through the DBT. What fertilizer, to my mind, is a lot tougher to implement. It's tended to be producer-based. How can we move it to a more consumer-based basis would be interesting to see. But the subsidy bill for fertilizer clearly needs rectification, and I'd be curious to see how that comes through this year.
Throsoni, what about the question of labour reform as a critical step to, in fact, boost manufacturing? Make in India is a critical element of the Modi government's economic policies. Many industrialists believe that Make in India is not going to happen unless labour reforms happen as well. Now, he's permitted the Rajasthan government to relax labour laws, and Madhya Pradesh is thinking of doing the same, but the central government is not acting. Is this something that Mr. Modi needs to do?
Well, I think the point on Make in India is crucial. I do not put that much of relevance on immediate change in the labor laws to kickstart it. I would put much more emphasis on getting demand up here in India, and which you've already covered. But another point not covered is that all Make in India manufacturers have to look at the global market, not just the domestic market. And this budget hopefully will give out some signals, some incentives for increasing exports, because that is what is going to bring us growth and jobs domestically. So while we look at making labor usage more efficient and multi-skilling more adaptable, I think we should open the pie more, and the world is really our window, and not just to think of in India, and we've really not done too much over there.
You know, I want to bring you in on this point of Make in India versus what Raghuram Rajan called Make for India, Sunil Munjal, at a time when the world economy is very close to what would be considered by international standards some sort of international recession. It's barely growing at 2.5%. Europe is growing particularly slowly. The only engine of growth is America. Even China is slowing down. Can we hope to make in India and sell abroad in substantial quantity? Or should we be making in India and really making for India? And that, in a sense, will determine the rest of the budget.
To this. Yeah, well, there are two aspects to this, Karan. One is, if you can make competitively, you will make for India and for the global markets. You have to do both. You cannot do one or the other. And that's the point I think Dhruv was making as well. The second is, you have to learn to become a part of the global value chain, which is how different geographies, different countries have developed their manufacturing capabilities, is that manufacturing value comes from across geographies now. We have to be an embedded part of these major value chains. We've done it in the automotive sector quite successfully. India has become the center for compact cars for the world. The Indian automotive component industry has done an exceedingly good job. So we can certainly do this in defense, we can do it in home construction. There are a number of sectors available to us. IT hardware,
so
where we can actually do the same thing.
What is it that Mr. Modi and the budget need to do to facilitate what you're talking about? Are there 2 or 3 key steps in your mind? So, if they are, tell me.
There are 5 elements. The first is on taxation. We are one of the highest manufacturing taxed countries in the world. So GST must come in, and must come in at a moderate rate so that manufacturing becomes more competitive.
Number 2?
And the cascading impact of taxes on manufacturing goes away. Number 2 is the labor reform that you mentioned. Number 3 is infrastructure. Today it costs more to transport goods from Delhi to Mumbai than from Beijing to New York. We have to improve the cost of intermediation and transportation and logistics within India. That is absolutely necessary for us. Fourth is, our banking system needs to get strengthened. Fiscal consolidation is a necessity right now for India, for the overall economy, but certainly would be a big help for manufacturing.
And 5?
And the last one is, we need to develop the clusters. We need to develop clusters around major manufacturing bases so that the major OEMs have their supply chain close to them.
Okay.
And things like education, skills, training are also being done in the same centers. So you develop complete centers of excellence around in a few places, which can then truly help India become a manufacturing nation for the world and also manufacture for India.
Nana Lalkazai, let me bring you in on this key question of reforming the public sector banks. Now, in his last budget, Mr. Jaitley did talk about it. He talked about, at some point, disinvesting a certain element of bank shares so that the money would go back to banks to refinance them. Not very much has happened since then. What are you hoping for in this budget? Because many others also believe that reform of public sector banks is a critical issue. What are the top 3 things you'd look for?
Well, I think the first and foremost is the capital itself, because the projection really is a huge amount. I mean, almost $50 billion that needs to come in for Basel III till 2018. And I've just seen an estimate in The Economist, which I'm not sure I fully buy into, which suggests it's $85 billion because of the NPAs of these banks. So it's a lot of money that needs to come in to capitalize these banks.
Number 2?
So some amount of provisioning of this will have to happen in this fiscal deficit. The other is really, how are we enabling the banks to sort through their bad debts? willful defaulters, ability to sell bad debts, securitizations, the vehicles that are available to them and the laws that are available to them to restructure and set their balance sheets right. And this process is still very cumbersome, and we do absolutely need to look at the levers we give the banks in order to sort through these situations. And the third aspect, which is really squarely back at the PMO and is really being seen to by the project management group they had set up, is to sort out the projects themselves that are causing the NPA. And I do believe there's some movement on that, not fast enough, but there is movement. And as we see these coal auctions and whatever kick in, we will see some of these projects come alive again, which is critical, so that the bank's NPAs, as they come down, gives them a lot more room and flexibility.
Now,
but there's a huge amount out there, including the governance structures, holding companies, etc., which could take a day to discuss.
Dhruv Sawhney, in the lead up to the budget, something that is becoming clearer day by day, sometimes even hour by hour, is that the government's ordinances may not have an easy future. Some of them may lapse, some of them may have to be reissued. Does it worry you, for instance, that the insurance ordinance may not get a clear passage? Does it worry you that land acquisition could be diluted? It's under enormous pressure, not just from opponents on the street and the opposition in parliament, but from allies within the NDA. So does the future of insurance and the land acquisition amendment worry you?
Yes, it does. But Karan, I'd like to add 2 points to Sunil's for the manufacturing.
Can you answer my question first before you go off to something else? Answer my question and then you go to Sunil.
All right. I would say that the land acquisition law is really something which will be very unfortunate if we do not make some changes. And while it has become a political football, the reality is that if we want investment, we have to make land acquisition much easier and much more reasonable. And that, to me, will be a great shame if that doesn't become an act of parliament. I personally am not feeling that the insurance bill is going to affect growth in the manufacturing sector, for example, that much. Neither should it affect direct foreign investment into, if the way of investment, if the rules and all are changed, and we make the investment climate easier. So I don't think that one is going to have as much effect as the non-passage of the land acquisition. But the 2 points I wanted to quickly finish, Karan, if we are really going to kickstart the manufacturing sector, we've got to give some incentive in this budget for exports. And the way is to give a tax break on incremental exports. And the second most important is we haven't for many years, for 10 years, made R&D well oiled in India. The stipulations and the laws are terrible. If we really want to start making in India, we have to adapt our products for the global market. We have to do this, and we have to incentivize value engineering and R&D. I think it's far too complicated.
You spoke, Sunil Munjal, about GST as being a critical element. If I recall correctly, it was either the third or the fourth thing in your scheme of 5 important things that Mr. Jaitley needs to do. What sort of roadmap would you like him to lay out for GST? Last time, he didn't even announce a start-up date. Now people are speculating it will be perhaps the 1st of April 2016, but that's still speculation. So what roadmap would you like on GST? A quick answer.
So we would like to hear him say that they will start the implementation in 6 months, because you need a cut-off date. It could be any quarter, not necessarily only the start of a new year. It could actually be accounted for in the companies and in the government's balance sheet in any one startup of any one quarter. So if we give it 6 months, because what needs to be done is quite well known. It's been discussed now for many years. We need to put a backbone, which is an electronic network, where work has already begun, and last 2 or 3 years there was work done on that. And I wish we would be able to implement GST across the country, and I wish we would be able to bring in all goods and services taxes and roll them into one.
And the deadline for starting GST is 1st April 2016. Is that what you want him to announce? A quick yes?
Yes.
All right.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
All I can say is I hope the Finance Minister and I hope Mr. Modi as well is listening. There's a lot of valuable advice they've got. They've been told by some of India's top bankers and industrialists exactly what they're looking for. It's only now a matter of 4 days before we discover whether you've got what you've asked or whether you're going to be disappointed. My thanks to all three of you for joining me.